I always believed my life had purpose. For over 3 decades I served as Father Thomas, a priest to a modest parish in a quiet town. My days were filled with prayer, leading Mass and guiding my congregation through their joys and struggles. It was a life of devotion, shaped by certainty and structurean anchor in an otherwise chaotic world. From the moment I entered seminary, I was drawn to the clarity the Church offered. The rituals, the teachings, the unchanging hierarchy, they gave me a sense of belonging to something far greater than myself. In those early days, I carried a deep conviction that as long as I followed the Church's path, I was doing God's will. My parish wasn't large, but it was my family. I knew the faces and names of nearly everyone who attended Sunday Mass. They looked to me for guidance, for answers in times of uncertainty, and for the reassurance that their faith was not in vain. And for many years I gave them that assurance without question, believing wholeheartedly in the institution I represented. But as the years passed, subtle cracks began to appear in the foundation of my certainty. They weren't obvious at first, just small, nagging moments that made me pause. It began during meetings with Bishop Andrew, a man I once admired for his wisdom. One particular discussion stands out, a debate over whether to expand a food pantry program for struggling families in our community. I passionately argued for its expansion, convinced this was Christ's work. Yet, Bishop Andrew dismissed the idea with a calm, practiced reply. "Our focus," he said, "must remain on the outreach programs are a distraction from the spiritual needs." I nodded, as was expected, but his words left me unsettled. How could we speak so much about Christ's love and then ignore his call to Over time, these small dissonances grew. I was asked to perform a wedding for a prominent family, despite knowing the groom openly disregarded the church. "It's good for the church's image," a fellow. Another time, I turned away a single mother seeking baptism for her child because she didn't meet the diocese's rigid. When I expressed unease, Father Michael simply said, "Rule." Though I carried on with my duties, I found myself retreating to the confessional not for others' sins, but for my own. In whispered prayers, I began asking questions I never thought I would. "God, am I serving you as you desire? Is this truly what—" I told myself these doubts were a test of faith, a phase that would pass if I prayed harder. But they grew heavier with each passing year, casting shadows on a life I once believed was. It was an ordinary Sunday morning, the kind I had experienced countless times before. The sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of the church, casting vibrant hues onto the pews. Familiar faces filled the seats, their voices blending into a gentle hum as the choir began the opening hymn. I stood at the altar, reciting the Eucharistic prayer, my hands raised in blessing. For a moment, everything felt as it always had, serene and steady. But then it happened, a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest that caught me off guard. I paused, gripping the edge of the altar, thinking it was just a passing discomfort. When the pain spread to my arm and jaw, panic began to creep in. My vision blurred, and the words I had spoken countless times before escaped me entirely. The chalice slipped from my trembling hands, its metallic ring echoing in the hushed sanctuary as it hit the floor. Gasps filled the air, my knees buckled, and I collapsed, clutching my chest. The last thing I saw were the concerned faces of my parishioners rushing toward me, their mouths moving in panic, though I couldn't hear a word. Darkness enveloped me. What followed is something I've struggled to put into words ever since. It wasn't fear or pain that greeted me in the void, but stillness. Time seemed to evaporate. My senses were dulled, and yet I felt more aware than ever before. Then came the light soft at first, growing into a radiance so warm and enveloping it felt as though it reached into the depths of my soul. I was floating, weightless and unbound, gazing down at my own body lying on the church floor. The chaos around me seemed distant, muted. I could see every detail. The sunlight reflecting off the scattered chalice, the tear-streaked faces of my parishioners. Yet none of it felt urgent. I was no longer tethered to the moment. The light began to pull me, gently but irresistibly, and I let it. I was immersed in its embrace, a love so profound that words could never do it justice. It wasn't just around, might was within me, filling every corner of my being. For the first time in years, I felt utterly at peace. Then, from within the light, a figure emerged. At first, it was a silhouette, undefined and blurred against the brightness. But as it approached, I saw him clearly. He wasn't the Christ of paintings or statues. He was more real than anything I'd ever encountered. His gaze held no judgment, only love, boundless and overwhelming. "You've carried so much," he said, his voice resonating within me. "But why have you burdened yourself with what I never asked of you?" I was speechless, tears streaming down my face. This wasn't just an encounter. It was a revelation. And though I didn't yet know it, this moment would change everything. When I woke up, the world felt strangely muted. The fluorescent lights of the hospital room seemed stark compared to the warmth of the radiance I had just left behind. My body ached, heavy and grounded by the weight of flesh, but my spirit felt unburdened. Parishioners surrounded my bedside, their relief evident in tearful smiles and whispered prayers. They told me I had collapsed during Mass and been rushed to the hospital. I nodded weakly, murmuring thanks, but the words felt hollow. How could I possibly explain what had happened? How could I describe a presence so overwhelming, a love so infinite, when I could barely comprehend it myself? In the days that followed, I tried to piece together what the experience meant. I replayed the words of the radiant figure in my mind. "Why have you burdened yourself with what I never asked of you?" It felt like a rebuke, but also an invitation to let go of the weight I had carried for so long and see faith through a different lens. At first, I thought my fellow priests might understand. I shared fragments of my experience with Father Michael and Father John, men I had trusted for years, but their responses were cautious, even dismissive. "Thomas," Father Michael said, his brow furrowed, "near-death experiences can be deceiving. They're often tricks of the mind or worse, the devil's work. You mustn't let them cloud your judgment." But it wasn't a trick, I insisted. It was real. I felt God's presence in a way I never have before, not in the rituals, but in love itself. Father John leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Be careful, Thomas. The Church has stood for centuries because of its traditions. Straying from them leads to chaos." Their words left me feeling isolated, a stranger among those I had once called brothers. But it wasn't just the priests. Some parishioners began to notice changes in my sermons. No longer did I focus on sin or rigid doctrine. Instead, I spoke about love, humility, and grace. While many welcomed the shift, others grew uncomfortable. One Sunday, a longtime parishioner, Mrs. Harper, approached me after Mass. Her voice was filled with frustration. "Father, we need to hear about sin and confession. Without rules, how can we be good Catholics?" Her words stung, but I managed a soft reply. "Rules have their place, Mrs. Harper, but love is the essence of Christ's teachings. If we love God and one another, we fulfill all He asks of us." She frowned, clearly unsatisfied. "That's not enough," she said before walking away. Moments like these tested me. The warmth I had felt in the light clashed with the cold resistance I now faced. The more I tried to share the truth I had seen, the more I realized how deeply entrenched the Church was in its rigidity. The love I had experienced, the love I now wanted to live, was a language many around me were unwilling to speak. The days turned into weeks, and though my body healed, My heart felt restless. The warmth of the light I had experienced during my near-death encounter lingered within me, compelling me to act. But the institution I had served faithfully for decades now felt like a cage that confined my understanding of God to rules and rituals. I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were, so I began to chart a new path. My first steps were small. I started visiting the sick and elderly more often, not just as their priest, but as someone who genuinely wanted to listen and share in their lives. One afternoon, I sat with Mr. Langley, a widower battling terminal cancer. He had always been stoic, keeping his struggles to himself. That day, he opened up about his fear of dying. "I am afraid of what comes next, Father," he admitted, his voice trembling. I didn't respond with scripture or platitudes. Instead, I held his hand and said, "You are deeply loved, Mr. Langley. That love will carry you through, just as it has all your life." For the first time, I saw tears in his eyes. It wasn't my title or my knowledge of doctrine that brought him comfort, it was the simplicity of love and presence. These moments gave me purpose, even as I faced resistance from my colleagues and parishioners. My sermons became less about obligation and more about connection. I spoke of Christ as a figure of boundless love, someone who reached out to the marginalized and broken without judgment. I urged the congregation to see him not just in the church, but in the faces of the poor, the lonely, and the forgotten. Not everyone embraced this change. Some left the parish, uncomfortable with what they saw as a departure from tradition. But others stayed, drawn to a faith that felt less like a rulebook and more like a relationship. I began to form deeper bonds with those who had long felt alienated by the church's rigidity. One woman, Emily, shared her story with me after a Sunday Mass. She had been turned away years ago when she sought baptism for her child because she was unmarried. "I thought God didn't want people like me," she said, her voice heavy with pain. "God's love doesn't come with conditions," I told her gently. "You are enough just as you are." Her tears flowed freely, and I realized that these moments of connection were what faith was truly about, not the rituals, but the relationships. Despite the growing tension with the diocese, I felt freer than I ever had. The love I had experienced in that radiant light was now guiding me to live my faith in ways that brought life, not constraint. Each visit, each conversation, each act of kindness deepened my conviction that I was finally walking the path Christ had meant for me all along. It became clear to me that the path I was now walking no longer aligned with the expectations of the church. My conversations with the bishop, my colleagues, and even many parishioners confirmed this. To them, I had become a wayward priest, too focused on love and grace, straying from the structured teachings that had defined the institution for centuries. One afternoon, Bishop Andrews summoned me to his office. His expression was grave, his words carefully measured. "Father Thomas," he began, "your recent sermons and actions have caused concern. Parishioners are uneasy. They feel you've abandoned the doctrines that give them spiritual guidance." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Your Excellency," I replied, "I haven't abandoned my faith. I've found it. For years, I thought devotion to the church was the same as devotion to God, but now I see they aren't always the same. Christ's love isn't bound by rule sets alive in the way we care for one another." His lips pressed into a thin line. The church has survived for 2 millennia because of its structure and traditions. Without them, we have chaos. You must reflect on your vows and where your priorities lie. I left the meeting with a heavy heart, knowing what I had to do. That night, I sat in the quiet of my rectory, the candlelight flickering on the walls. The weight of my decision pressed on me, but it wasn't fear, it was resolve. The church had been my home for so long, but I now understood that my calling was no longer within its walls. The next Sunday, I stood before my congregation for what I knew would be my final sermon. The pews were full, the air heavy with expectation. I spoke from my heart, sharing the journey that had brought me to this moment. For so many years, I began, I believed that faith was about obedience, following the rules, upholding the rituals. But I've come to see that faith is something far greater. It's about love, the kind of love that sees no boundaries and asks for nothing in return. I saw confusion in some faces, tears in others. God's love is not confined to this building or these traditions. It lives in each of you in the way you comfort the grieving, feed the hungry, and embrace the outcast. That is where Christ dwells. When the service ended, I lingered for a moment, taking in the faces of the people I had served for so long. Some came forward, offering words of gratitude. Others kept their distance, unsure of how to respond. But I knew this was the right step. I left the parish that day with no plan other than to follow the love that had transformed me. I began a new ministry, one without titles or walls, devoted to serving those who had been left behind by systems and traditions. For the first time, I felt truly alive, free to live a faith that reflected the boundless love I had encountered. This was not the end. It was a beginning.